Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you are doing well. I know that we're very, very busy. I'm well aware that many of us are working multiple jobs, staying home and taking care of family. We've got school and class. Many of us don't have a good workspace. I'm actually in a different room in my home than usual because it's just a little bit loud in the apartment complex tonight. So I'm trying to get some space and kind of get away from things. But I just want you all to know that as we come up to the end of the semester, I empathize with you, and I know that you're under a lot of stress and that we're doing our best to make the most of a difficult situation. And I do admire you because you've been doing really good work and you continue to stay engaged and you show up every time. And we always have such a good discussion in this class. It's it's a great class, and so thank you so much for being here, and let's just get through it, do the best that we can and have a good attitude and stay engaged. As you will recall, we are addressing a very important topic, which is narco trafficking and narco politics in Latin America. This is one of the three big challenges facing Latin American countries, along with corruption and inequality. We're focusing on these three challenges in this class because they impact democratic progress and because they really are consequential for the lives of ordinary people in particular. And so we've talked about corruption and inequality, and now we continue our discussion of narco trafficking and narco politics, which so far has focused on Colombia and Mexico, but also the United States. And we've discussed how Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia are producer countries that are the sole source of coca in the world, and therefore they are essential to the production of cocaine. Mexico and Central American countries being distribution or sort of distribution route countries, and then the United States and Western European countries as being consumers of these illegal narcotics produced and distributed by Latin American countries. And so this discussion has us focusing on really the world, and it has us thinking about how Latin America has become connected to all sorts of places for reasons that relate to the drug trade. Let's discuss the impact of the drug trade and begin to take a look at the experiences of Colombians and Mexicans. We'll watch some video, but we'll also describe the situation and try to get a feel for it so that we can understand the consequences politically and economically and socially. So remember that we did say that the drug trade is a important contributor to transnational crime, both because cartels launder money and because of their access to illegal arms and the smuggling of arms, kidnapping, extortion, and bribery, all sorts of illegal activity, oil theft, you name it. All of these activities go hand in hand with the drug trade because these large cartels finance themselves in a variety of different ways in addition to producing or distributing drugs. And these different sources of finance they leverage to distribute and produce more drugs. And so a good recent example comes from a scandal that was sort of, or a scandal, or kind of like a situation that was discovered years ago where Wachovia, which is owned by Wells Fargo, was discovered to be effectively helping to launder billions in cartel drug money from Mexico. Maybe it was Colombia. I'm forgetting what the origin country was. But the point is, this money had been sent around the globe and had been effectively laundered by Wells Fargo's Wachovia sort of conglomerate. And it all happened in a way that sort of appeared to be above board, but upon closer inspection by U.S. authorities was obviously illegal. And so this transnational crime is truly transnational, and it's partly a result of the integration of global in domestic economies. Of course, there's also environmental and community damage. Usually to plant coca, you've got to, of course, destroy vegetation and trees, and you've got to change the environment pretty substantially, which changes the ecosystem, and that can have all sorts of consequences for human and non-human communities. And then there's also the simple fact that the the social fabric itself can be affected by the drug trade and by narco trafficking and by conflict. Relatedly, there is the reality of civil war and violence that often accompanies narco trafficking and narco politics. We'll see that in Colombia, a decades-long civil conflict between the central government and the FARC, in particular, a far-left guerrilla group that finances itself with drug money, has resulted in the displacement of almost 6 million people, as well as the deaths of scores and countless people. This violence and displacement is directly related to narco trafficking, precisely because of the importance of that as a source of finance and as being an illegal source of finance for the FARC. We'll talk about and we'll see how that plays out in real time with some footage here in a moment. Corruption is also a huge problem. In Mexico in particular, we hear a lot of stories about public officials that become compromised, either because they are bought off by cartels or because they themselves have ties to cartels. We hear about police and security forces being infiltrated by or sort of being bribed by cartels. It can become a serious, serious problem when public officials and police and security officers are corrupt in this way and are corrupted by the cartels, because this results in turn in impunity, and impunity often reigns in these situations. In Mexico, cartels are stronger than ever, and when one drug kingpin is eliminated or arrested or caught, a new one takes their place, and new cartels might emerge or fragment. And in general, the sort of regeneration of these groups has meant that not only do they continue to keep pace and to expand, but there's also a tremendous difficulty holding them accountable. And even those who are captured often escape. And we've seen examples over time of certain leaders who've escaped multiple times. And so there's a level of impunity that often accompanies this that is staggering. And this often is closely related to the corruption and the bribery and the extortion that sometimes is practiced by these groups. And so the case of Colombia is really an important case because, as you know, Colombia produces 42% of the world's coca, and the Andes of South America, which includes Colombia, is the world's sole source of coca, which is the base or the sort of foundation in cocaine. And drugs in Colombia are important, not just because peasants and farmers make income that way, but because groups like the FARC and the AUC, which is a far-right paramilitary, finance themselves with profits from the production of illegal narcotics. And so remember from the video that we watched, the farmer, the peasant, produces the coca and then sells the coca to whoever. And it's typically groups like the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia or the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. These are different examples of armed groups. Groups like this purchase the coca, and then they use the coca to make cocaine. The farmers will make the paste itself, but they sell that to these armed groups who then will produce the drug itself, and then they'll sell the drug off to other groups that are engaged in the distribution of the drug. The FARC and the AUC finance themselves with profits that they make from selling cocaine after the production of the cocaine. And so drugs should be understood as, excuse me, a central part of Colombia's decades-long civil war, which has been fought between the central government and armed groups like the FARC or the ELN, which is also a leftist group. Now, the AUC is a a far-right sort of paramilitary group that has often worked alongside the Colombian military as part of this campaign to eliminate the leftist guerrilla insurgency. But both sides are financed by drug profits. And so the displacement of 5.6 million people in Colombia by the ongoing civil war should be understood as directly linked to the financing of these armed groups with drug profits. And so Colombia is a country that is very, very closely associated with coca production and cocaine for these reasons. And what's interesting when you look at the map is you see that despite that association, there's actually only a relatively small part of the country where coca can even be cultivated. And so given that, it becomes especially relevant when we consider that people in Colombia who are displaced have to pan out into all these different areas of the country as a result of the displacement. And so we'll watch a video right now about areas around Bogota where people have been displaced as a result of violence that has spilled over in connection with the cultivation of coca and activity around Bogota related to drug production in these armed groups. So let's watch this video.
Water Delivery Day in Alto de la Florida, Colombia. Almost all of the 3,000 residents living on this hilltop settlement were displaced by either armed groups, gang violence, or poverty. Jamaira Sokara came with her 4 children.
Me desplazaron porque en ese tiempo él era soldado profesional, entonces.
There are nearly 7 million displaced people in Colombia, the highest number in the world. Jamaira settled in the outskirts of Bogota. She met a man who said he would sell her some land, the land her house is on.
Dice contrato de compraventa, posesión de lote de terreno. Entre los suscritos por saber parte a la señora Yamaira.
But the sale was never recorded at the land registry office. None of the sales here were. UNHCR has been working with the displaced residents and the government to change that. Nieves visits regularly.
Una de las cosas que hemos hablado mucho con la alcaldía municipal es el tema de la legalización. Y desde hace unos años nos han dicho que tiene bancos, pues es difícil.
Yo me siento que soy la dueña de él, o sea, me siento con valor de este terreno ya dándome cuenta, o sea, mirando que Alto de la Florida nadie tiene una escritura en ninguno de los sectores que hay.
Some things have improved for the residents of Florida. More electrical lines are being installed. And now there's even a bus service. Home improvements are ongoing, as is new housing. Everyone here lives in the hope that the land issue will be resolved.
Bueno, yo en Alto de la Florida me siento bien, doctora, con las necesidades, pero no con cariño hasta lo humano.
Even without land titles, the displaced of Florida want to stay. Here they have found some security and something denied to them for years, a place to call home.
So this is really interesting footage because we see that in many of these cases, not only are people displaced by the violence, which is financed by drug profits in the first place, but they often are taken advantage of because if they're able to purchase land upon which to build a home or to settle, they might be swindled and might be given a false sort of ownership registry, or maybe their ownership is never actually certified or registered with local authorities. And so in this case, in Altos de la Florida, which is an area around Bogota, huge numbers of displaced people have settled. Huge numbers of them have purchased land, but they don't legally own that land because when they purchased the land, the purchase was never certified or was never registered by the seller. And so this is an example of how vulnerable people who are displaced by violence are then taken advantage of yet again as a result of their circumstances. And this is a situation that's very common in Colombia. Just a minute, everyone. I need to clear my. So what has the US response been? So far, we've discussed the impact. We've talked about the main players, the size of the drug trade, and the nature of narcopolitics, given the size of the trade and these players. It stands to reason that the US has an interest or a stake in what happens. And that certainly is true. The US response has been multifold and large in scope and sustained over several decades. But as you'll see, this response has been largely inadequate. And indeed, consumption continues to increase. And one of the questions is, why has the US response remained the same over decades despite limited success? That response has mainly been a focus on the disruption of external supply. The idea has been, look, eliminate the supply of drugs and you can eliminate the problem. And so this has taken the form of Plan Colombia in Colombia. This is a huge initiative that has been brought to an end relatively recently, but over several decades cost about $5 or $6 billion. Just an absolutely huge investment. Then there was also the Merida Initiative in Mexico and Central America. And this is a similar approach focusing on external supply, but it's been also largely inadequate. There have been some successes, but the main issue is that whenever the United States and Colombian forces and Mexican forces are able to eliminate croplands, they reemerge, they reappear in some other place. And this becomes extremely difficult over long periods of time because you can't patrol or cover every area all the time. And so in these places, especially in Colombia, in the highlands, it's very difficult to exert control over long periods. And so there's this continuation of production. And oftentimes there's just kind of like a geographical shift that takes place to kind of avoid new detection. And so the results have been both positive and negative. The Merida Initiative has been criticized especially harshly. It's been considered too little too late, especially considering so much money went to Colombia. And the Plan Colombia initiative itself was also largely inadequate too for these reasons. And so the criticism of the US response has been quite acute. Nevertheless, if you go back into the record books, you'll find images like this from 2014, where Colombian soldiers arrived to an area of coca plantations to take part in a joint operation with peasants to eradicate coca plantations. This took place in the highlands, that area of the country. Well, much of the country is in the highlands, but areas of the country that the central government has a difficult time reaching because of the geography. And this initiative was, of course, financed largely by the United States, but with the cooperation and the active involvement of the Drug Enforcement Administration and a variety of different institutions of the US government. But Plan Colombia was a substantial investment that to this day is considered essentially a failure, but a very expensive one. Quinn says, I would say if the US is so concerned with illegal narcotics that they ought to invest in communities in Latin America. But then I worry that the corruption would keep that money from ever materializing in those communities that need the investment most. Absolutely, Quinn. A more developmental or integrative or sort of rehabilitative approach would involve creating community organizations, investing in institutions, making it possible for people to access credit to start small businesses, access other sorts of income, or plant other types of crops like cacao or other products, anything of that sort. If they're really concerned about the production and consumption of illegal narcotics, the supply approach is really faulty, because you can always produce more somehow, some way, and it's not possible for any government to spread itself so thin that it totally eradicates the production of the drug. But at the same time, as Quinn points out, corruption is a serious challenge in Latin American countries. And if that investment was to be siphoned off by politicians, that would be a disaster, because then it would just be a loss, and there would be no gain from the point of view of reducing the problem of the drug trade. And so it's a very complex issue. And one of the things that we've noticed is that in countries like Mexico and Colombia, one way that they've reduced corruption in the police and in the military and in the security forces is by paying them more. Paying them a higher wage, so that they don't have an incentive, or have as much of an incentive, to be bribed or to be corrupt, and so on. But there are a variety of different considerations, and corruption is a difficult nut to crack. Marcella says sometimes the people are scared to ask for change, since they all have seen what has happened to other people that speak up. Absolutely. And especially when violence is acute, and when fear of retribution for speaking up is very real. In fact, we know that a big reason why there's a migration crisis and an immigration crisis at the southern border is because of people fleeing violence and fleeing threats to their life, that are often connected with drug violence or narco trafficking. So we've begun to talk about Colombia and the US response to narco trafficking and production in Colombia. And this gives us a chance to kind of step back and trace the process to its origin in Colombia. Now, many of you maybe have seen Narcos, or you've seen Pablo Escobar. Maybe you've heard about how Pablo Escobar was so rich and so well connected because of the drug trade that he was able to import elephants. And he had his own personal zoo in his house. And to this day, the Colombian authorities don't know what to do with all of his elephants and his exotic animals. And it's really kind of an interesting situation. It's a strange testament to the scope and the magnitude of the drug trade, and in the sophistication of some of these DTOs in Colombia. And Colombia, more generally, has been home to some of the most violent and sophisticated cartels in the world, these drug trafficking organizations. And Pablo Escobar is just one example of a leader of one of those cartels. But that cartel and all of them have in common significant capital, deep pockets, advanced technology, sophisticated social networks. They're very well connected politically and socially. The Colombian drug trade has evolved substantially over the years. It wasn't always the case that these organizations were so sophisticated. They had relatively modest beginnings. The primary product at first was marijuana, but the reason that it changed to cocaine was because other sources of marijuana production began to emerge, and eventually legalization and access to medical and recreational marijuana in the United States meant that it was less lucrative to produce marijuana at the same scale. So cocaine has become more important over the years, coincident and concurrent with changes in US policy. But despite those modest beginnings, Colombian cartels are the most sophisticated and the most violent in the world. And let's talk about some of the different examples. Maybe the most infamous example is the Medellin cartel, which we associate with Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, the Ochoa brothers, and Pablo Escobar. Here's Pablo Escobar. Here are the Ochoa brothers. In the Medellin cartel, from the beginning, would fly small aircraft directly into the United States. They would often land in Florida, the shortest point to the United States from Colombia, and they would use these small aircraft to move marijuana and cocaine, and they would reap massive profits because of the street value of those illicit narcotics, especially marijuana and cocaine. The violence of the cartel was also notable, and Pablo Escobar was sort of infamously violent and merciless in his treatment of rivals, and the power struggles and the competitions between cartels would often expose the worst of that violence. And so in some ways, the Medellin cartel lives on in our imagination as well as in real life because of its stardom, because of how well known Pablo Escobar alone is. He's sort of a household name. In fact, there's a good chance that many people have heard of Pablo Escobar, but maybe haven't even heard of the Medellin cartel per se. But the elephants in his personal zoo, again, are an interesting testament to the hugeness of the profits and the sophistication of the cartel and the way they were able to benefit from the drug trade. The Cali cartel is another example that sticks out, and this is actually an image from Narcos, where the Orjuela brothers are characterized. And in the Cali cartel, they were more businesslike in their operations and less inclined to use violence as mercilessly, at least, as Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. In the mid-1990s, the Cali cartel came under heavy fire from the Colombian government. Thus began a sustained conflict between the two. Eventually, the Colombian government did prevail, and leaders were arrested and served or are serving prison terms. But the Cali cartel is another example of an infamous drug trafficking organization associated with Colombia and renowned for its sophistication, its size, and its scope, and distinctive because of its business-like operation and its willingness to not use violence unless necessary. But these figures really stand out because of their size and their stature, and because of the tremendous benefits and profits they were able to generate through the drug trade. Little wonder it was so lucrative when so much is consumed in the United States and when consumption increased so substantially in the 70s and the 80s. Now, it should be mentioned that the United States has actually seen reductions in cocaine consumption, and that should be considered an improvement in public health. In the 70s and the 80s, cocaine consumption hit their height, and it was during that period when it was most accessible and most expensive relative to to what I guess you would pay today, although I wouldn't know. The point is that cocaine was much more common and much more widely consumed, and for that reason, these cartels were able to generate enormous profits. And the Cali cartel, in particular, was targeted by the Colombian government because of those profits. The Medellin cartel is more noteworthy because of the violence. It's okay, 80, no problem. Sometimes my internet goes out. So where is Colombia today? We've talked about Plan Colombia and how it came to an end in 2014, 2015 formally. It went on for a couple decades. During that period, almost $10 billion was sunk into it by the United States. Colombia today is really in no better shape than it was before. And in fact, it's in some ways in worse shape. The Cali and Medellin cartels, they did modernize the drug trade in the Americas. In the 1990s, they were crushed by the Colombian government with the support of the United States. The Colombian authorities took down drug kingpins. They took down the main leaders of these cartels. But what happened was the cartels fragmented into more and more cartels, smaller and smaller organizations. And so, although there was success rolling back the leadership of some of these big key drug trafficking organizations, they splintered into smaller organizations. And that has meant even more disorganization, even more competition, even more violence, and in more disorder. That's been disastrous for Colombian society and for the Colombian state as well, because on the one hand, it has undermined and caused the disintegration of the social fabric. At the same time, it's also meant that the state faces a much more fragmented and incoherent sort of opposition, if you will, because the cartels are essentially aligned against the state in the sense that they have competing interests. In the fragmentation of the cartels into smaller and smaller units has meant that it's more and more difficult for the state to battle them effectively. You have all of these enemies and all of these opponents as opposed to just a few. And so it's become much more difficult to exert control. And it's been very, very destructive socially because of the disintegration of the social fabric. In Colombia, more generally, has witnessed a kind of corrosion, if you will, and the continuation of the civil conflict and the role of drug trafficking and drug profits in fueling the conflict is obviously an important part of the story. Before we continue and begin discussing Mexico, I'd like to pause and ask if anyone has any comments or questions about Colombia. Does anyone have any insights or any ideas or any opinions about the country or about the situation there? The situation remains critical because of the continuation of the drug trade and because of increased consumption. And the results have continued to be disastrous. Do you have any ideas or any comments about Colombia? Okay, so let's discuss Mexico. Remember that Mexico has a different experience than Colombia because Mexico is a distributor country. It is a country chiefly involved in the dissemination or the distribution of the drugs produced by Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia. And as such, it sort of plays a different role in the drug trafficking organizations and the groups involved are engaged in different kinds of activities. Mexico has always been a key player in the Latin American drug trade. In the 80s, US interdiction efforts in the Caribbean were very, very extensive. And it had the effect of shifting drug flows to Mexico. This is what we'd sometimes refer to as a geographical shift, where efforts to exert control or clamp down on production have the effect of shifting production to some other area or some other region of a larger region. This is what took place in the 1980s. And it goes to show you that it's difficult to reduce the supply of an illicit narcotic. Even if you're able to successfully reduce the supply in a given area, it's very likely to just shift. It's very likely to shift to some other area. And that's what happened in Mexico in the 1980s. And so Mexico wasn't always at the center of the drug trade, but it became at the center of the drug trade in the 1980s as a result of this. And as in Colombia, the early dynamics of the Mexican drug trade were a little bit different than they are today. The first notable dynamic was the cash and payment component or dimension, which involved the laundering of cash into American and European banks in large quantities. A second dimension that was notable was a constant shifting balance of power between different DTOs or cartels. In the early days, there was a very fluid political environment when it came to the cartels, and there wasn't an established sort of set of power relations between them. And it meant that the balance of power would shift relatively quickly if any organizational changes occurred, or if any cartels or groups would align or form larger blocs. And that meant in turn that there was growing violence. And from the 1980s, that shifting balance of power gave way to a lot of conflict. And you'll see momentarily that at that time, there was a need for the PRI-led Mexican government to establish a cooperative set of relationships with drug trafficking organizations in order to reduce the violence and reduce the merciless conflict. Marcella says, in my opinion, changing the way that people live, such as producing coca, will take a long time to change since some people are used to this way of living. Absolutely, Marcella. I think that growing coca is sort of like an institution, and institutions have cultural and cognitive components, right? So not only do people have a way of life that is associated with it, but they also have limited knowledge of alternatives. And that's why the role of the government becomes important. So in the case of Colombia, like in the video we saw, producing cacao can be beneficial for farmers who previously produced coca because they can benefit from subsidies from the government and they can get other forms of support. But think of that transition. It requires learning a new skill or learning about how to produce cacao and to produce it well. And that might be a transition that can be costly and can be cognitively difficult because of a set of skills that might not align with that. But then again, the role of the government can be important because they can help to facilitate that transition. Back to Mexico, remember that we're in the 1980s, and this is a period of rising violence associated with a shifting balance of power and a lot of fragmentation in cartels. In Mexico, a number of important or sort of infamous or well-known figures would emerge in this shifting environment of conflict and increasing violence. El Padrino was one of them. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, he founded the Guadalajara cartel, and he was the point man for the Medellin cartel. So he had a very important role both in Mexican organizations and a Colombian organization in the Medellin cartel. He was also responsible for the death of, pardon me, let me go back. He was not responsible for the death, although he was held ultimately accountable and did have to respond to the death of a DEA agent, Enrique Camarena, in the 80s that added pressure from Mexican and US agents. This was in 1985, in August of 1985. And the death of this agent became a very important trigger in the sort of increasing efforts of the US government to clamp down on Mexican cartels in cooperation with Mexican authorities. In response to this increased pressure, Gallardo divided up the Guadalajara cartel into a number of smaller cartels in an effort to sort of evade that pressure from the authorities. Remember how I said that the splintering of cartels represents a serious challenge for the state because it becomes more difficult for the state to exert control and sort of suppress multiple different cartels that are disorganized and fragmented. That was the same situation in Mexico. And Gallardo was very, very smart and knew that splintering in that way and dividing up the cartel in that way would help it to more effectively evade those authorities who were seeking to clamp down on cartels after the death of Camarena. Gallardo was eventually arrested in April 1989, and it brought this story to a close. And it really highlighted the nature of the unfolding dynamic, the shifting balance of power, the fragmentation of cartels, the relationship between the Mexican state and the cartels, the role of the US government, the role of events like the death of Camarena. All of this is painting a very interesting picture, but one that is also very, very bloody and very, very difficult. Eddie can't wait for the next season of Narcos. Now, because the situation in Mexico was so difficult, and because the violence was so extensive, and because the splintering and the fragmentation of cartels represented such a challenge, there were three different types of counter-narcotics operations that Mexican governments would carry out over the course of several decades. And all of these different systems or operations represent specific approaches or efforts to reduce the violence and to establish order. The closest analog or the closest thing I can give you to the situation on the ground in Mexico at this time is the sort of disorder and violence that often accompanied state building in the post-independence period after independence in Latin America. Remember that was a period of disorder in relative chaos because of the difficulty establishing central authority, because of the fragmentation, because of the competition between groups. In some ways, the drug violence and the violence between cartels in Mexico is similar. And the three periods of counter-narcotics operations all represent distinct efforts to address that violence and establish order. The first system, or the first set of operations, is what we call the Plaza system. And that was put in place in the 1960s, and it lasted until about 1982. The collapse of the Plaza system was a period that corresponded from about the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s. And the drug war corresponded to the mid-1990s to the present. And this is the three time periods that we'll focus on now. So the Plaza system was basically an informal agreement between criminal organizations and government officials. Another way of putting this is to call it the formal term that we've given it in political science. We call this a state-sponsored protection racket. It's basically an agreement between the state and between criminal organizations. The rules are pretty simple. The criminal organizations can't fight themselves, and they've got to provide the state a cut of the profits from the drug trade. In return, the state will allow them to function relatively freely. This is basically a cooperative relationship between the central government and criminal organizations. In Mexico, those rules, as I said, included la mordida, the bribe paid to the government, and then the limitation imposed on violent behavior. The gangs would basically agree not to fight each other. This was an equilibrium. It was a situation where none of the actors had an incentive to change their positions. The government gets a cut of the profits, and the groups are able to function freely and and do so peacefully as long as they provide a cut of the profits. This system worked well for a couple decades, and it coincided with the period of authoritarian rule under the Institutional Revolution Party. And this system was very interesting because it represented the institutionalization of corruption, essentially. Bribery is corruption. And La Mordida was the institution, the mechanism for institutionalizing that corruption. And the Plaza system has always been interesting to me because it's an example of how institutions in the political economy can basically legitimate and institutionalize corruption in a way that becomes productive for the actors in the system. What do you all think of this? Do you have any comments about the Plaza system?
I mean, if you actually think about it, it just functions like a normal business, with the only limitation that it's because the drug's illegal. It's not identified as a business, but it functions like any other business. You work and you pay like taxes for the government for functioning as a business. So like, if it was just legal, if drugs were legal, this would be basically a business for corporations and small businesses, for example. It will work the same way.
Yeah,
As a
Abel, I
normal.
like the way you put that. And the only difference is that the drugs are illegal. And so therefore it's not a tax that they're paying, it's effectively a bribe, right? If
Yeah,
it
exactly.
if it was legal, it would be a tax.
Yeah,
But it's not, so it's a bribe. And I think that you're right, right? This is the way that in a legal economy, the relationship between the government and the business works. The government establishes order and in peaceful relationships in society, and in exchange, businesses and economic actors pay taxes to finance the state. And so this is sort of like a contract, a kind of economic and social contract between the criminal organizations, the drug trafficking organizations, and the state. And so from the perspective of just making society and the state function, this is a system that works on a contractual basis just like any other system. And so if we kind of put aside the question of the legality or the illegality of drugs, it's a system that works pretty effectively. Christian says it works and can be beneficial, but it still has the huge issue of it being drugs being sold. Right, Christian. And so that's where the issue arises, because we know that the illegality of the drugs means then that it contributes to transnational crime. It contributes to extortion and kidnapping and bribery and other kinds of theft, and the smuggling of weapons and arms, money laundering, illicit business schemes, you name it, right? The corrupting of public officials, security and police. That's the main issue, the fact that it is illegal. And so it works, right? But then we have to consider, well, what about the impact of narco trafficking? And does the Plaza system then contribute to that? And I think that the answer would have to be yes. But from the perspective of a closed system, that system did work well to create order within Mexico, and to perform the function of establishing peaceful relationships between otherwise violent actors. Maricela says, I think that although they are paying a bribe, it makes sure there's no innocent lives destroyed, since there would be no point of fighting for something that is legal, in my opinion. Yeah, Maricela. And so the benefit of the La Mordida system, the bribe system, was that it did reduce the violence. And in fact, what's interesting is that when Mexico transitioned to democracy, and we'll see this here in a moment, the Plaza system collapsed because it was basically a kind of feature of the authoritarian state. And when it collapsed, the violence increased again in the number of deaths, in the number of rapes, and the number of assaults all increased. And so the numbers seem to indicate that the system worked to reduce violence. despite that it did legitimate and institutionalize corruption and illegal activity. So beginning in the mid-1980s, the plaza system started to collapse. And the reasons are many. First and foremost, there was an economic crisis, and the economic crisis put strain on all the different actors in the system. And it meant that the incentives changed, especially for the state, whose sources of income were far more minuscule and far less lucrative. Political competition also increased substantially over the 80s. The PRI was in power for most of the 20th century, but beginning in the 1980s, they faced more and more competition at the polls from opposition parties. And what that meant was that their hold and their grip on the state began to weaken. And as their grip on the state began to weaken, the plaza system that the party had helped to construct began to start to fall apart. US pressure also contributed to the collapse of the system, as did the arrest of Phoenix Gallardo, because the arrest of Phoenix Gallardo was viewed by the cartels as a violation of the terms of the agreement. Remember, the agreement was the state would not arrest or harm the cartels. They would let them be, as long as the cartels would give them a cut of the profits from the drug trade. The arrest of Felix Gallardo was viewed as a violation of the rules, because that was an example of the authorities not letting the cartels be. And so all of these factors worked together to produce the disintegration of this system in the 1980s, which is the period we see here in this beautiful photograph that I found. But the collapse of the party system was really consequential because it contributed to increased competition between the drug trafficking organizations. Now that they were no longer cooperating, they're now competing again, and that increased violence significantly. It also increased counter-narcotics policies in Mexico in response to the increased violence. And so the end of the plaza system was quite consequential because of the impact on both politics and on social relations. What was originally a relatively stable system of peaceful cooperative relationships between those different actors, the state and the DTOs, became a much more conflictual and competitive system that was much more prone to violence. And this is sort of where we are today. At present in Mexico, the policy on the ground is the policy of the drug war. This is a policy of police reform and heightened counter-narcotics operations carried out by state authorities within cities as well as within the countryside. And what you see here is you see a mission, a counter-narcotics mission being carried out within a city in Mexico. And the reason for these operations, of course, is to try to reduce the significant violence being waged by the cartels against each other in this growing game of competitive relationships between them. The drug war that began in the mid-1990s and continues today is all about this competition, this violence, and the situation has continued to deteriorate. There's been virtually no progress. And in fact, it's plain to see for anyone who takes a look that the situation today is night and day different from the relative peace that was observable in the 80s and the 90s, or at least until about the mid 80s when the plaza system began to collapse. The drug war then is a difficult and challenging policy and a set of social relations that have been quite destructive in Mexico. The situation in Mexico continues to be pretty dire in some places. Do you know, for instance, that in some places in Mexico, the death rate is comparable to death rates during war in some places in Iraq? And so the situation then should cause us to pause and think carefully about the policies that have been in place over time and whether there could be potentially some benefit to cooperative relationships between the state and drug trafficking organizations. Maybe we don't have to go that far, but maybe there's something in between that's more developmental. Like we saw in that video on Monday when they interviewed that law professor who talks about law and narcotics, it's difficult to imagine a world where the cartels cease to exist. Perhaps there is a more developmental approach that could represent a middle ground that would be less violent and would be more sustainable. Now, the situation on the ground in Mexico, interestingly and depressingly, has continued to deteriorate even despite COVID-19. This is a video that is very recent and talks about the violence and the continued conflict between cartels in Mexico, who have continued to fight each other and more aggressively than ever before, even despite the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's pause and watch this and get us a sense of the situation on the ground.
Just arrived in Culiacan and have got a phone call from a local crime reporter here that there's been a shooting in the center of the city. There's a guy who was driving his car. He was shot in traffic. We think it's gang related. We're heading there now. It's the policeman said that was basically a hit job gone wrong. A couple of guys came to kill him, shot him in the leg, shot him in the arm, hit him over the head. And then before they could kill him, they got spooked by the amount of cars that had been stopped.
2020 is set to become Mexico's deadliest year on record. Despite hopes that the COVID-19 crisis would slow down violent crime, it's had the opposite effect. More than 17,000 people were murdered in the first half of this year alone. In Culiacan, a city of about 800,000 and the headquarters of the notorious Sinaloa cartel, no one is off limits. For Ernesto Martinez, it's the brutality of the killings that stand out.
So what happened? Se encontró a un agente de la policía municipal ejecutado. Prácticamente le cortaron la cabeza.
Jesus Manuel was a 42-year-old local police officer. A few days before he turned up dead, he'd been kidnapped by cartel members.
Aquí hay tejido ya todavía.
That's his brain.
Hey.
Oh man, really? Why would they have done this? Like, what was he involved with them in some way?
Desde mi punto de vista personal, es mucho odio, ¿no?, para esta persona. Las autoridades han declarado que son los riesgos que corre un elemento de una corporación. Hasta ahorita ninguna autoridad ha dado una declaración de alguna pista o algún...
This is hard to believe, you know what I mean? That they've shot a police officer 65 times. Do you think anybody will be punished for this?
Absolutamente no.
In the middle of our interview, Martinez was tipped off about another murder.
Ahí vamos para allá.
A couple of days later, family held a funeral for murdered officer Jesus Manuel. Armed officers were a major presence. Cartels have a habit of shooting up the funerals of officers they've killed. The mood was tense.
I tried to talk to people from the family. They're all too scared. The police are too scared. The police don't want to talk to me because they don't even trust each other.
446 officers were killed last year in Mexico, and this year that number could top 500. So far in the case of Jesus Manuel, there'd been no official statements, no arrests, and seemingly no attempt for justice. The cartel who allegedly killed the officer were the Sinaloa cartel, one of the most powerful in Mexico.
We're about 2.5 hours outside of Culiacan, and this place is so far beyond government control. I haven't seen police cars for about an hour. All you see is guys like this on quad bikes with guns.
Todo está áreas de nosotros, el ganado, la agricultura, también sembramos mota, solfia.
This is so far away from any city. Do the police ever come by here?
Así han llegado a venir, pero solo pasan por caminos y uno ya mismo, pues muchas veces le da dinero uno, otra vez piden solo comida, otra vez quieren mujeres y eso.
How much do you have to pay an officer or the military to keep them off your back?
Para estos lados es por temporada. O por ejemplo, póngale unos 50,000 pesos 15 días, 100 al mes. Que si ellos vienen en buen plan, pues nosotros en buen plan, nosotros cooperamos con ellos. Y si ellos vienen en modo agresivo contra nosotros, pues nosotros nomás repelemos la agresión.
A couple of days ago in Culiacan, a police officer was kidnapped. To me, they seem like acts of terrorism, you know, if you're kidnapping police and killing them.
Usted no sabe qué puede hacer el policía. Muchas veces un policía corrupto que hacen cosas indebidas. O simplemente pues no quieren jalar con el carro, como dije luego.
Many here feel the Sinaloa cartel are the real authority in the region. They believe to control the majority of Mexico's drug trade. The Department of Homeland Security estimates $19 to $29 billion a year is made from sales in the US alone. Guys like this in the mountains are a small but vital part of the trade. They grow and transport marijuana and opioids into the US.
Aquí la tenemos para que la moto ocupa un lugar fresco y seco para que conserve su aroma.
Yeah, it's definitely weird. How much is this worth?
Esto viene siendo aquí unos 30 kilos. Anda como 600 pesos, algunos 18,000 pesos cuando mucho.
Has coronavirus made it any more difficult to smuggle it into the States?
Pues desde que está el coronavirus está todo parado. No hay frontera, no hay cruce, no hay compra y pues aquí está celdas y prieto. Hasta que alguien se la lleve o la tiren.
So how much money do you think you're losing right now?
Estaremos hablando de millones.
Do you think that might be a reason for some of this violence? The fact that, you know, cartels aren't really making the money they usually do?
Pues sí, como por ejemplo los carteles que tienen que mantener su gente y todo, tienen que sacar dinero donde hay. Si ya se acabaron sus reservas, pues tienen que buscarlo.
How old are you guys?
Yo tengo 27.
13. 13 is young, isn't it, to get involved in this game?
Pues está pequeño, pero entre más pequeño más aprende y le gusta.
I mean, do you want to be one of those people? Have to kill people?
Sí.
Ya vio lo que quiere ver el muchacho.
At a time when COVID-19 restrictions have closed down many of the usual routes into the US, demand has grown for guns for hire to help fight for territory that remains.
Do you think at some point another cartel is going to come and try and take this from you?
Que nosotros no nos llevamos con ellos porque hay mucha gente que nosotros no nos llevamos con ellos.
Who really controls Mexico? Is it the authorities or is it the cartels?
Pues el gobierno. El cartel llega hasta donde el gobierno quiere. El gobierno es el verdadero jefe.
What's in it for them?
La mayoría de las ganancias van a dar a ellos, a los altos mandos del gobierno.
The current government says they're focused on stamping out this corruption, but Mexico consistently ranks towards the bottom of global corruption indexes and ranked 130th out of 180 countries in 2019. We flew to Mexico City to meet with Olga Sanchez, the Secretary of the Interior.
Being an extremely powerful member of government, you know, have you ever been approached by a cartel? Have they asked you to try and do things for them? Have they threatened you? Have they tried to get you on their side?
Nunca. Las grandes corrupciones son o empiezan en las esferas de poder y se van filtrando hasta los policías municipales.
How is it that so many murders can go unsolved and so many people can get away with it?
En virtud de deficiencias en la investigación y deficiencias en la policía al detenerlos y deficiencias al consignarlos. A veces los fiscales están amenazados. A veces los jueces están amenazados.
Esa es una realidad.
I acknowledge that you inherited a very difficult situation. I don't deny that. The question is, when will your policies see results?
Lo que pasa es que aquí tienes tú que combatirlos a diferentes niveles. El nivel más importante no es el fuego ni tampoco un armamento pesado. ¿Sabes qué es? La congelación de cuentas, aseguramiento de cuentas y la estructura financiera. Pero sobre todo, social. Quitarles la base social a la delincuencia y a los cárteles. Hoy les vamos a dar a los jóvenes oportunidades y van a ganar casi lo mismo, que cuando los coopta la delincuencia.
Despite the government's promises, many in the cartel don't believe there's a real reason to ever leave the trade. It's not just about money, it's a way of life.
A ver, hazlo. Pero con paciencia, que no te muevas.
Yeah, how does it feel to shoot?
Bien, me gusta.
So he wants to be a vet. What do you think's more likely? He's going to be a vet or he's going to end up in the cartel killing people?
Pues yo la verdad lo que veo que va a terminar siendo mañoso. Le veo más futuro de mañoso que de veterinario.
Why do you think that?
Porque mire cómo anda de contento con las armas aquí. Y es lo que le gusta donde anda.
No, porque está mal, yo quiero ser veterinario.
Did you want another life before you entered the cartel world?
Yo soy piloto. Y estudié, pero agarraron al patrón. Y aquí ando mejor.
Local advocacy groups predict only 5% of murders are solved in Mexico, meaning most homicides go completely unpunished and ignored. This impunity is felt hard by Mexican families, and many are left never knowing the whereabouts of loved ones and with no hope of closure. Mirna Quinones leads the trackers about Fuerte and Los Mochis, a group of mothers who are looking for answers on their missing children.
¿Te acuerdas cuando vimos el cuerpo de Eduardo aquí en la...
Este grupo tras la desaparición de Roberto Corrales, mi hijo, fui con las autoridades para que me ayudaran a buscarlo y pues recibí un rotundo no. Puedes decidir por cuenta propia empezar a buscarlo.
The organization has over 1,500 missing persons in the database. Over the last 6 years, they found 204 bodies, doing a job they feel the authorities should be doing.
Es que no huele a podrido, huele. Estamos descartando esta superficie que ves que está sumida. Entonces metemos la varilla y si la varilla sale con aroma o sale con algo y al meterla y si hay un cuerpo ahí adentro, sale el aroma aquí o sale pedacitos.
The group has such little faith in the Mexican justice system, they aren't even looking for accountability. They gave up on that long ago. Instead, they're just hoping for closure.
The best these women can hope for right now is that they'll be reunited with the remains of their loved ones. At the moment in Mexico, justice just isn't possible.
We don't have justice in Mexico, in any place, any country. There's no justice for us.
Is it ultimately dangerous though, because if you ask too many questions and you really try and find out what happened, you could be next, you could get killed yourself?
Maybe they will kill me if I ask too much. So just look for them and that's all.
So in this video, we saw all of the elements and the themes that we've discussed. We saw impunity, we saw corruption, we saw the relationship between power structures and drug cartels. We saw the role of threats in how prosecutions get called off because of violent threats or because of fear struck in the hearts of judges or those who might hold cartel leaders accountable. And so the situation in Mexico continues to be quite grim, and there are real questions about whether the central government or the cartels really have the power. And in places like Sinaloa, it looks like there's a case to be made that the cartels have the power. At the very least, the impunity that reigns is devastating. And so we see then that this has a real effect, and it's hard to understand politics without considering the role of narco-politics in Mexico. Yeah, it is incredibly sad. And the astounding thing, as Quinn points out, is that the cartels will shoot up funerals for people that they've already killed. And that's pretty incredible. Not even possible to get closure at the funeral. Marcella says, it's sad to see children recruited for cartels. It is even sadder to hear that they like being in it when in reality they have a big future ahead of them. Yeah, that's certainly sad. And I think that another thing to consider is that there isn't always opportunity for many young people. And in the example of that person who was studying as a pilot, he said that his boss was arrested and therefore he lost the opportunity to study. There wasn't more in that moment for us to learn about the situation, but it just seems to suggest that in many situations people don't have a choice, or they feel like there might not be an alternative. And so that's depressing and difficult to stomach as well, because the violence that results from the expansion of the cartels could potentially be avoided if there was more investment in the economy and in the communities themselves. So we are out of time, but the questions that I wanted to ask you, and the questions that I think we should begin Monday's class with, are the following. Why are the cartels winning? A consistent theme throughout this lecture has been the dominance of these cartels and the sort of power struggle that has been waged in the ways that the cartels have infiltrated government institutions and the ways that they've come out on top in this continual battle with the state in Mexico as well as in Colombia. And then relatedly, but maybe separately, would you rather accept legalization or give billions to cartels? Because at the end of the day, this is not an analytical issue. It's an analytical issue as well as a political one. And the question of legalization is a question that bears on life in the US. And it's a question that brings to mind different sets of policies and different ways of addressing the issue. And I wanted to ask you, would you rather accept legalization or to continue to give billions to the cartels? So these are questions that we will take on Monday. I'll do my best to reintroduce the topic of narcopolitics. I think that this is a way for us to have a nice discussion. But at least for now, we are out of time, and I want to thank you for being here. I hope that you have a good remainder of the week. I'll see you next time.